Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Nicole and I like to do fashion DIYs, and in today's video I am going to be attempting to make a duffel bag made out of those IKEA bags. And I'm kind of on a really big upcycling bags into other bags kick lately, so far I've made a backpack out of LULULEMON shoppers, and I made a fanny pack out of Amazon packaging. So if you want to check those out, I will have those linked down below. So this is kind of the next installment, is an IKEA duffel bag. So one thing that I've definitely learned with working with this type of plastic material is there is very little room for error, because those needle punctures will be there even after you seam rip. So it has been quite the journey. I have learned a lot. I think this duffel bag is going to be fairly easy. I think it's just like the size that kind of intimidates me, but I'm excited to see what I'm going to be coming up with. I really wish that I had yellow buckles and yellow like sliders and stuff. Unfortunately, it's just like impossible to find on such short timing notice. So all I have is black. I don't love that, but it could be worse. Before I get started, please be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up if you like what you are seeing, and let's get into the tutorial.
For this project, you will need 2 IKEA FRAKTA bags. I wanted mine to be more sturdy, so I'm adding a lining, and I chose a complementary yellow fabric that was a heavier weight. I also chose to use a yellow zipper, make sure it is durable enough for a bag, and I also picked up some matching webbing. When I purchased this, I didn't know what I would use for it, but I got 2 yards of each color because it matched, and I also used 2 side release buckles. To create the pattern, I'm going to start with the sides of the duffel bag. To get my perfect circle, I actually just traced a pasta bowl from my kitchen, and then I used my ruler to extend each side by 1 inch. I wanted the bag to be a little bit bigger, plus I needed a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then I cut out my pattern piece. To create the body of the duffel bag, I had to jot down some measurements. I wanted the final width to be 20 inches wide, but to figure out the length, I needed to figure out what the circumference of my circle was. And to do that, I multiplied my radius by 3.14, which came out to 37.75, and I wanted to make sure my pattern piece was cut on the fold, so I needed to make a piece half that length, which was 19.5 inches. Once I factored in a seam allowance, I drew that out. I also added a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the width before cutting. I had to cut out an additional piece to tape together because my paper wasn't long enough. I will need to cut one of these out of the lining and the IKEA bag. So I think the most difficult thing about this project was trying to get this bag to lay flat so I could cut my pattern out. But the first thing I did was remove my straps, and to keep them as long as possible, I seam ripped them off as opposed to cutting them off. To help my bag lay flat, I use these mini clothespins instead of pins. This way I don't get any puncture marks in my material. Since I was having a hard time laying out my pattern piece to be flat, I ended up measuring out the width of my pattern and then started cutting down the sides without my pattern. Once I had cut the width, it allowed the bag to lay flat, so I could clip my pattern piece so I could finish cutting it out. The leftover pieces of the sides fit the circle perfectly, and I cut out 2. Then moved on to cutting out the same pieces with the lining. I cut out a strip that was 5 inches by 26 inches. This is going to be used as my shoulder strap of the bag. I also cut out a small rectangle and used this as the inside pocket. Before I moved on to the sewing part, I pinned my duffel side to my duffel body to make sure I had my measurements right. Since this material was difficult to hide mistakes, I really had to make sure it fit before I started. And it looks pretty good. I'm going to start by making my pocket. I took my rectangle and folded the top down 1 inch and sewed a top stitch. I then pressed with my iron and folded each remaining raw edge about a 1/2 inch before pressing, and I did that to all 3 sides. I'm trying to start incorporating these little logos I made for myself onto my pieces, so I'm just folding the ribbon to size before pinning it in place and hand stitching it down. To attach the pocket to the lining, I found the centers of both pieces and lined them up, and I also double checked that it was straight before pinning and sewing a top stitch around the pocket. Now it looks something like this. To make this fabric a little easier to work with, I'm going to use my iron to press my seam that I'll be attaching my zipper to. I am turning the steam function off and reducing the temperature. I also placed a layer of cotton fabric over my plastic to make sure I don't burn anything. To attach my zipper, I use the seam that I just pressed with my iron to line up my zipper with my material, with right sides together. Then I took my lining and placed it right sides together, pinning the zipper and lining together before sewing. So my materials were sandwiching the zipper. Then I flipped it right side out to sew a top stitch with a matching blue thread. Once that was done, I did the same thing to the other side. First, pinning the zipper to the material, then pinning the lining down before sewing it all into place.
Okay, leave it to me to forget that I was supposed to sew on these straps before I attached the lining and the zipper, but here we are, backtracking. Obviously I'm not going to go back and seam rip what I just did, so I'm going to make do sewing my straps onto my bag while everything is attached. I think I can do it. It's just gonna take a little finessing, but that's okay. So my vision is that these straps, the IKEA straps, are going to go around the circumference of the bag and be little handle straps. But I'm also going to be making a shoulder strap out of the lining material, so it's like a pop of yellow as well. So stay tuned.
I had to first iron out my handle straps since they were so creased, and then I marked the center of my bag so I could figure out the placement of my straps. To make sure they were centered, I measured from each side of the strap as well, then stitched a top stitch along the strap of the bag, making sure not to catch the lining as I sewed. Then I did the same thing to the other side. Since the straps weren't long enough, there was a gap at the bottom I needed to fill in, so I cut 2 straps to length and top stitched them in place. Moving on to the side pieces, I'm going to find the center of my circle and take my yellow webbing and half of my buckle and pin it down. Then I stitched all the way around the strap. Once it was sewn, I trimmed off the excess webbing and repeated the same process to the other side. I then pinned my lining to my material and sewed them together. To attach my sides to my duffel, I marked the quarters on both pieces and clipped them together before carefully sewing it into place.
Okay, after I wrestled with the circle, the side piece, one side is now sewn. It's not perfect, but the material is pretty difficult to work with, so I'm trying not to be a super perfectionist because, again, I can't really seam rip and redo it, and I just kind of have to just let it go. But because this is the inside and you can see this messy exposed edge, I kind of wanted to use cord strap, the strap material, as a binding, I guess. So I'm just going to be folding it in half and sewing it all along the inside. So before I can go ahead and do that, I do need to trim all the excess so my binding will fit around my bag. So I'm gonna do that and I will show you how it looks.
So after I trimmed the excess off, I pinned my binding to the bag and sewed it into place. And I think it turned out pretty well. Now it was time to do the same to the other side. Moving on to the shoulder strap, I folded right sides together and pinned before sewing. Then I moved my seam to the middle and pressed open. I then flipped it right side out. And I took some padding material and measured out a piece that had a width slightly smaller than my strap. Since my padding wasn't long enough, I had to make mine out of 2 pieces and slide them together on either side by feeding it through my strap. And then I stuck a safety pin through to secure both of my straps. I measured out 2 pieces of the webbing that were the same length and pinned them to the other half of the buckle to it before tacking it down. I then slid one into each side of the shoulder strap, shaping the end to make it look like this squared edge, and sewed it into place. I did the same thing for the other side, and then the next step was to sew down the center of my strap to keep the padding from slipping. And then I very noisily flipped it right side out and connected my straps to the bag, and it was done.
Okay, so that concludes today's DIY, and honestly, I am obsessed with this bag. It is so cute. I can't wait to go somewhere where I need a lot of stuff so I can bring it with me. It's definitely bigger than I was anticipating, but I also wanted to make sure it was big enough that it can hold a lot of stuff, and I think I achieved that. And maybe it just feels big in relative size to me because I'm a short person, but either way, I'm extremely happy with the way it turned out. I think I like the inside just as much, if not more, than I like the outside. So overall, this was a very successful DIY project, and if you guys would like to stick around and see what else I create and what I am planning to make, I have a couple really fun ideas that I can't wait to execute or attempt to execute. So subscribe if you want to see what I get up to, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye!